If you still believe God hears people when the figures say there is no way left, type Amen below. In March of 1985, the loan officer at First State Bank in Independence, Iowa, unfolded Eli Halvorson's note with both hands like it was already a burial paper. He cleared his throat and read the default line slowly enough for every person at the table to feel it. If the interest was not brought current, if the collateral position weakened further, if the bank judged the operation insecure, the note could be called at once. Somebody laughed. Not loud, not long, just one dry little laugh from the backside of the room, the kind a man makes when he thinks the ending is already written. Eli heard it anyway. Outside, old snow sat gray along the ditch banks, and the March wind kept tapping the bank window with loose sleet. Inside, his wife Martha kept one hand on the family ledger. His son Caleb stared at the oak floor. His daughter Anna looked at the pink carbon copy in front of the banker and seemed to understand, maybe for the first time, that a farm could disappear on paper before it disappeared from the ground. The loan officer was not a monster. He was tired, careful, and already speaking in the language of exposure, liquidation, and voluntary sale. But when Eli asked for 30 more days until the last hog check cleared and the rest of the stored beans were hauled, the room went still in a way that felt worse than shouting. Because everybody there knew the numbers. What nobody knew yet was this: the laugh would not be the end of the story. It would only be the sound that followed them into spring. And if your family has ever sat in front of a desk while somebody else explained what your life was worth, tell me that in the comments. This is the story of an Iowa farm that could not be saved the way they first dreamed, and the family that learned too late that sometimes the prayer is not for more land. Sometimes the prayer is for enough grace to keep from losing each other with it. In 1985, the Halvorsons farmed east of Independence, where the fields rolled gently and the black dirt could make a man believe in permanence if he let himself. They had a white two-story house with a porch that sagged a little on the south side, a red barn older than anybody still living in it, 2 low hog buildings behind the windbreak, for grain bins by the road, and a machine shed that always smelled like grease, coffee, and cold iron. The home quarter was 160 acres. Eli's father had bought most of it after Korea, 1 parcel at a time, and paid for the last 80 with hog checks folded into envelopes and carried to the bank in a seed corn cap. In 1979, when corn was strong, land was climbing, and every farm paper talked like bigger was the same thing as safer, Eli signed for the south quarter next door. 160 more acres. Good black ground. Pattern tiled in places. Expensive. He told Martha it would give Caleb room one day. For a while it even looked wise. On March mornings, Eli lit the yard light at 4:45, pulled on insulated coveralls, and crossed the packed snow to the hog lots before daylight. Martha started coffee in the dented percolator and wrote the week's bills on the back of feed envelopes. Caleb checked heaters, broke ice, and talked to the pigs like they were hired hands. Anna, home from community college more than she'd planned that winter, kept the household books in neat blue columns and still sang alto on Sundays at First Lutheran. The machinery was not new, but it was honest. A John Deere 4440 with more hours than paint left on the hood. A 4020 kept mostly for auger work. A 6-row planter Eli swore still planted straighter than men half his age. A 6600 combine that shook in soybeans, but held together if Caleb treated the separator like church glass. They were not flashy people. Grace before meals. Church every Sunday unless weather or farrowing said otherwise. No beer at the table. No bragging in town. Martha canned green beans in August, patched short coats in November, and still ironed a white shirt for Eli on Saturday night, because she said a man ought to sit in the Lord's house looking like he remembered who gave him breath. That was the life from the outside. From the inside, the farm sounded different. It sounded like burner fans, feed augers, diesel rattles, market reports at noon, and the soft click of Martha's adding machine after everybody else had gone to bed. The trouble had not come in one clean blow. It came the way most farm trouble comes, by layers. First came interest. What looked manageable in 1979 started turning ugly by the early 80s. The payment on the South Quarter stayed the same on paper, but the money used to make it got harder every season. Then land values slipped. Then hog prices thinned out. Then came a wet spring that pushed planting late enough to shave yield off both corn and beans. Then a gearbox went out on the auger. Then the dryer needed work. Then a hired man left right in the middle of fall. By 1984, every acre had started carrying too much weight. Seed, fertilizer, herbicide, diesel, repairs, interest on the operating line, feed, vet bills, electricity for the hog houses, property taxes, and the note on the South Quarter all wanted paying before a family could keep much of anything. Eli stopped buying parts unless something had truly failed. He welded what used to be replaced. He took one less load to town if a truck tire looked soft. He let the barn roof wait another year, even after a March storm peeled tin back like a sardine lid. Martha started doing books 2 evenings a week for the church secretary and never once called it extra work. Anna noticed before anyone said it out loud that the grocery envelope got thinner after February. Caleb noticed the way his father lingered at the mailbox, sorting bills before he brought them inside, like maybe he could keep bad news from reaching the kitchen if he handled it alone out by the road. The rented 80 from Edna Keller was the kind of ground a man kept in good years because it made the map look respectable. In 1985, it was the kind of ground that ate diesel and pride in equal measure. Caleb said they should let it go. Eli said giving up acres was the same as telling the whole county they were slipping. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was old enough to remember when a man standing in town was measured by how much land he could point at from the road. But pressure changes the meaning of silence in a house. At supper, Caleb asked straighter questions. Martha answered fewer of them. Anna pretended to keep writing figures while listening to every word. Eli said almost nothing unless it was necessary. And the town had eyes. At the co-op, men still talked like acreage was character. At the sale barn, everybody seemed to know who had renewed, who had been trimmed, who was late, who had moved. A payment to Summer, who had sold feeder calves early, who was hauling extra grain because the operating note was tight. Have you ever watched a family try to keep fear quiet so it doesn't become real? That was the Halvorsen house by the end of winter. Nobody slammed doors. Nobody cried at the table. But the whole farm had taken on that waiting. Sound a house gets before bad weather hits. One night in late March, after Anna had gone upstairs and Caleb had finally shut off the yard light, Martha stayed at the kitchen table with the ledger open, the bank notice beside it, and her old Bible under the lamp. She was not reading for a miracle number. She was reading because some nights a woman needs a sentence stronger than her own thoughts. Eli came in from the machine shed smelling like cold metal and sat down across from her without taking off his cap. For a long minute, neither of them said anything. Then Martha laid her finger on the page and said, very quietly, "We keep asking God to save the farm. Maybe we should ask him to show us what part of it we're actually supposed to save." Eli looked at her like the words hurt. Not because he didn't believe in prayer. Because he did. And because real prayer sometimes opens a door a man has spent months bracing shut. He said he had promised his father the place would stay whole. Martha said whole had already changed. Whole was not every acre. Whole was Caleb still speaking to him. Whole was Anna not being afraid of the mailbox. Whole was a supper table that did not feel like a funeral home. The wind pushed at the kitchen windows. The percolator had gone cold. Somewhere in the hog house a feeder rattled and settled. Eli took off his cap then, set it beside the ledger, and bowed his head over numbers he could not make behave. His prayer was not elegant. He asked for clean judgment, for courage without foolishness, and for the kind of mercy that let a man tell the truth before the truth buried him. When he stood up, nothing outside had changed. The note was still due. The land was still mortgaged. But for the first time in months, he said the one sentence his family had needed to hear. "Tomorrow," he told Martha, "we put every number on the table." They did. 2 mornings later, with seed catalogs shoved aside and coffee rings drying on legal paper, the Halvorsens spread every debt across the kitchen table. The land contract on the South Quarter, the machinery note, The operating line at First State. Feed bills. Electric. Property taxes. 2 veterinary statements. 1 past due repair account from the dealer in Jessup. When Caleb added the columns a second time because he thought he had made a mistake, the total did not improve. By Thursday, they were back in the bank. First State sat on Main Street with narrow windows and a lobby that smelled faintly of dust, wool coats, and carbon paper. Tom Vance, the AG loan officer, was waiting with a yellow folder, a legal pad, and 2 local board men who had begun attending larger farm renewals because the bank had gotten nervous about collateral. Tom did not waste words. He went line by line. Your operating debt had rolled longer than the bank liked. Your equity position on the South Quarter had weakened with land values. Your machinery schedule was heavy for current cash flow. Your hog income was too thin to support the present structure without an outside correction. Then he opened the promissory note and read the clause that mattered. Failure to bring interest current. Failure to maintain satisfactory collateral. Failure to provide reasonable assurance of repayment. In the event of insecurity, lender may accelerate the note and proceed to liquidation. Paper has a colder voice when somebody else reads it. Tom Vance set the note down and folded his hands. He said the bank had 3 realistic paths as he saw them. 1. The family brought the interest current, reduced the operating exposure, and presented a credible planting plan with tighter acreage and lower cash burn. 2. They sold machinery, trimmed rented ground, and voluntarily listed the South Quarter before the bank forced the matter. 3. The bank moved toward formal liquidation if spring financing could not be justified. Nobody in the room needed any of that translated. Eli asked what credible meant. Tom answered like a man who had said the same thing too many times that winter. Credible meant enough working capital to plant. Credible meant lower exposure against declining collateral. Credible meant a plan the board could defend if prices fell again or yields slipped. Credible meant the bank did not want hope. It wanted a map. Caleb finally spoke. He asked whether they could renew the operating line if they dropped Edna Keller's rented 80, sold the 40/20, and used the remaining beans to catch up interest. One of the board men, a cattle feeder from north of town, leaned back and said that might help, but then looked at Eli and asked the question that cut deeper than the note. Can your operation survive at the size your pride will allow? That was when the laugh came. Small, dry, from a man near the back who had probably meant it for the air and not for Eli's face. But once a room laughs at you, even for a second, the walls remember it. Martha lifted her head. Anna's jaw set so hard it showed in her cheek. Caleb's hands closed on the arms of his chair. Eli did not raise his voice. He only said, if I wanted to be humiliated, Tom, I could have stayed at the co-op. Tom Vance flushed and shut the meeting down cleaner after that. He said they would give the family 1 week to return with a revised plan. 1 week. No guarantees. No promises. But 1 week before the board voted on spring financing. When they stepped back out onto Main Street, the wind had sharpened. A church bell down the block struck noon. Nobody spoke until they got to the pickup. Then Caleb said, sell the South Quarter. Eli gripped the truck door and stared across the street at the hardware store window, where somebody had arranged shovels and seed starters like spring was a simple thing. That ground was for your future, he said. Caleb answered him without heat. No, it was your idea of my future. That one landed harder than the banker's note. On the drive home, Martha sat in the middle, the way farm wives sometimes do when a family is trying to hold one line together. Anna looked out her window at thawing fence rows and flooded ditches. Eli drove with both hands on the wheel like if he loosened either one, the whole truck might drift off the road. By supper, the note was no longer the only thing on the table. Now it was the truth. The fight came that night in the machine shed. Not because men plan their worst conversations there, but because farms teach people to drag their pain toward iron, as if a tractor can witness something without repeating it. Caleb had the service door open and was draining old oil from the 40/20 when Eli came in. The trouble lights swung between them, throwing yellow across the green hood and the stained concrete. Eli said they were not discussing family land like it was dead machinery. Caleb said land did not care what they called it if they could not pay for it. Eli said boys talked easy when their names were not on the note. Caleb said men talked proud when their sons were the ones expected to carry the shame. It built fast after that. Years of things that had not really been about land rose up wearing land's face. Caleb said he had come back to farm, not to spend 10 years pretending a bad deal was a legacy. Eli said every generation thought the one before it was foolish until life charged tuition. Caleb said he was tired of hearing that every sacrifice was for the family when nobody had asked the family what it wanted. Then he said the one thing he had probably been carrying for months. You'd rather lose us than let the county see you sell ground. The shed went still except for the ticking of the trouble light. Eli's expression changed, not in anger this time, but into the kind of hurt that comes when somebody says aloud the fear you were hiding from yourself. Martha had come out halfway through and heard enough. Anna stood just behind her in Eli's old barn coat, one hand at her mouth. No one cried. Real farm families often do not at the moment the injury is made. They get quieter instead. Martha told Caleb to go inside. Then she looked at Eli and asked him the cleanest question of the whole winter. Would you rather be right, or would you rather still have a son at this table in 10 years? He did not answer, because by then he knew the answer she needed was not the one he had been living. Later that night, Anna came downstairs for a glass of water and found her father sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark, except for the stove clock and a slant of yard light across the floor. She sat down without asking permission. Anna was not the child who argued. She was the child who watched, the one who noticed what every silence cost. She told Eli she did not care if there were 320 acres or 160 or none at all if the price of keeping them was turning the house into a place nobody wanted to come home to. Then she said something softer. Grandpa didn't teach us to worship the farm. Eli looked up. He taught us to work it, she said. That's not the same thing. After she went upstairs, Eli stayed there another hour with both hands around a cold coffee cup. Outside, the bin stood black against the sky with no stars. Inside, a man was beginning to understand that debt had already taken more from him than money. The next morning, Eli did what pride had delayed for too long. He made a list, not a dream list, not a harvest will save us list, a loss list. The rented 80 would go. The 40/20 would go. The old gravity wagons they barely used would go. Half the bread gilts would go. Martha circled 3 household expenses in red and quietly cut them without announcing herself noble. Anna called the attorney in town and asked what voluntary listing of the South Quarter would look like before foreclosure language touched it. Caleb phoned Edna Keller himself and told her they would not be taking her 80 that spring. She was kinder than he expected. She said 3 other families had already cut back that month. Then came a hardest call. Eli phoned Tom Vance and asked if the bank would consider spring financing on the home quarter alone, with the South Quarter listed immediately, machinery reduced, and the hog side downsized after the next check. Tom did not say yes, but he did say, "Bring me that on paper." By afternoon, the whole plan was spread over the kitchen table like triage. 160 acres home ground, corn on the better half, beans on the rest. No rented acres, lower fertilizer rates where they could without being foolish. No non-essential machinery spending. The operating line cut to survival levels only. The South Quarter listed before planting, not because they wanted to, but because selling it themselves was the last way to keep the bank from writing the ending alone. That evening, Martha asked if they should call Pastor Norm. Eli hesitated just long enough to prove he needed him. The pastor came after supper in shore boots and a brown coat that smelled faintly of wood smoke. He did not arrive with speeches. He sat at the same table as the ledger, listened longer than he talked, and when Eli admitted he felt like he was burying his father twice, the pastor nodded like he knew exactly what that meant. They prayed there in the kitchen, not for a miracle land sale, not for prices to suddenly turn, not for the bank to become sentimental. They prayed for an honest mind, a steady tongue, a soft heart in a hard season, and enough humility to recognize that starting over smaller was still starting over. If you had to choose, would you save the land or save the family? I'd really like to hear your answer in the comments. 2 days later, word had already spread. By small-town standards, the Halvorsons moved quickly. By family standards, they moved like people carrying glass. The 40/20 sold at a consignment line outside Jessup for less than Eli had hoped and more than Caleb had feared. Eli stood with his hands in his coat pockets, while another man started it and drove it away. He did not wave. The South Quarter listing went up with a local broker 3 days after that. 80 acres of good black Iowa dirt had once made a family look strong. Now a sign at the edge of the road made them look exposed. Martha watched cars slow down at the corner. Anna stopped going into town unless she had to. Caleb threw himself into fixing field cultivator shanks and checking planter chains because anger is easier to carry when it has a wrench in it. Eli, for the first time in his adult life, began to farm like a man who knew exactly what he could not keep. There's a strange mercy in that. It hurts, but it clarifies. The turning point did not come as rain or rescue. It came as two separate pieces of news on the same April day. The first was from a bank. Tom Vance called just before noon and asked Eli to come in alone. That phrase can empty a man before he's even left the yard. Eli drove to town in silence, parked by the alley, and climbed the bank steps with the feeling that each one was taking him farther from the version of himself he had been defending. Tom met him in his office, shut the door, and slid a one-page term sheet across the desk. The board would approve a reduced operating line for the 1985 crop year. Only the home quarter and immediate working expenses. No rented ground. No machinery additions. Quarterly reporting. South Quarter to remain actively listed. Any major deviation required review. The words were not generous, but they were life. Eli read the sheet twice. Then Tom told him the second piece. The South Quarter had interest. A neighboring family from 3 miles over had asked to see it. Not investors, not speculators, farmers. They wanted ground for their son and preferred a private deal over a sheriff sale atmosphere. For a moment, Eli felt relief and grief arrive together so fast he could not sort them. Tom, to his credit, did not interrupt it. He only said, "This is the narrow road, Eli, but it's still a road." When Eli got home, Caleb was in the shed and Martha was hanging wash inside because the wind had turned mean again. Anna was frosting a sheet cake for the church supper because even in a year like that, people still needed bars and coffee after funerals and confirmations. Eli stood in the doorway and said, "We keep the home place." No one moved at first. Then Martha closed her eyes. Caleb set down the wrench in his hand. Anna started crying before she meant to. But Eli held up a hand, because there was more, and because real mercy often arrives carrying a knife. We sell the South Quarter. The room changed again. That was the shape of the answer. Not victory, not ruin. A line drawn through the middle. Later that week, they walked the South Quarter one last time before the showing. The frost had finally come out of the topsoil. Last year's stalks whispered in the wind. A red-tailed hawk lifted off a fence post and crossed toward the creek. Eli stopped near the rise where you could see both quarters at once. He told Caleb he had bought that land because he was afraid small would mean failure. Afraid that if he did not add acres, he would be the generation that stalled out. Afraid the county would see him as less than his father. Caleb did not answer right away. Then he said, "You were trying to build something. I know that. It was not absolution, but it was the first plank of it." The sale closed in May. Not auction. Not under a sheriff's notice. Not with men eating pie while they watched a family shrink in public. The papers were signed in an attorney's office with bad coffee, a ticking wall clock, and too much fluorescent light. When Eli came outside, He stood on the sidewalk longer than he needed to. He had just sold the ground he had once believed would prove he had done right by his family. And yet the family was still there. That was the turning point, though not the kind anyone brags about. He finally understood what had been saved. The 1985 crop year was not kind enough to turn the Halvorsons into a testimony pamphlet. Corn was decent, not great. Beans were better than feared. The hog's side stayed tight. The reduced operating line meant every bill was watched, every repair argued with, every gallon of diesel noticed. But the home quarter got planted. The crop got harvested. The bank got its reports on time. The house got quieter in the good way again. Caleb stayed. That mattered more than Eli said out loud. By winter, the bins did not look full enough to impress anybody from the road, but the ledger had stopped bleeding red at the same speed. Martha still wrote figures carefully in blue ink, but there were fewer nights when she sat over them like she was guarding a sickbed. Anna went back to classes that January and told only one friend the full story. She kept singing at church. Her voice sounded older by spring. The county, of course, moved on to other people's trouble. It always does. Within 2 years, another family farther west lost more than the Halvorsons had. Then a man near Quaston had a sale. Then a banker in another town changed jobs, and people pretended that meant the pain belonged to a previous administration, like grief respects office turnover. But the Halvorsons did not forget the laugh in that room. Not because it ruined them, because it clarified them. Eli farmed the home quarter into the early 90s and never bought another acre. He also never spoke again about getting back to where they had been. That sentence died with the South Quarter, and it was better for everyone that it did. When Kayla married in 1991, the reception was in the church basement with ham buns, scalloped potatoes, and coffee poured by women who had seen half the county through one sorrow or another. Eli stood for the toast and said only this: "We learned the farm is a tool. The family is the inheritance." That was as close as he ever came to preaching. Martha kept the original promissory note in a box of papers for years, not out of bitterness, but because she believed some documents ought to survive as witnesses. When the ink faded, Anna copied the date and amount onto an index card and tucked it behind the original like a daughter, making sure memory could still be read. The home quarter stayed in the family. The South Quarter did not. That is why this story is bittersweet instead of triumphant. They did not keep all the land. They did not get the years back that fear consumed. They did not erase the shame of listing ground in a county that noticed everything. But they also did not lose the porch, the barn, the graves in the churchyard, the table, the Sunday shirts, the songs, the habit of coming home, or the son who might have walked away if pride had been fed one season longer. Sometimes faith saves the farm. Sometimes it saves the people on it. And sometimes those are not the same rescue. So if you've ever had to choose between holding on to a thing and holding on to each other, I hope you'll tell me in the comments. What would you have done? Would you have fought for every acre? Or would you have let some land go to keep your family whole? And if your family has ever lived through debt, foreclosure pressure, auction fear, or the quiet shame of starting smaller than you planned, I'd be honored to hear that too. Because out in the country, people talk a lot about what was lost. But sometimes the holiest part of the story is what stayed.